Mail-order husband arrived in rags, but the cowboy's daughter saw his worth and married him. The winds howled across the dry, dusty plains of New Eden, a small frontier planet on the edge of the galaxy. The land was harsh, unforgiving, and vast, stretching for miles under a pale orange sky. It was the kind of place where only the toughest survived, where men and women alike toiled for everything they had, never knowing when the next storm would hit or when the next bounty would arrive. The town of Edgewood wasn't much more than a few wooden buildings, a saloon, and a small store where settlers could gather supplies. It was a quiet place, where the work was hard and the people even harder. Everyone knew everyone else's business and nothing went unnoticed. That was why the arrival of the ship carrying the new mail-order husband caused such a stir. It was late afternoon when the ship landed, kicking up a cloud of dust as it touched down in the small clearing near the outskirts of town. A crowd quickly gathered, eager to see the newcomer. The mail-order service had been running for years, but it was rare for someone from Edgewood to get chosen. Most of the men and women on the planet were already married, or too set in their ways to accept a stranger into their lives. But here was this ship, coming from the central colonies, bringing with it the promise of a new beginning for someone in town. The townspeople watched eagerly, hoping for a man who would fit in, a strong, capable rancher perhaps, or a rugged cowboy who could hold his own against the land. They waited for the doors to open, excited for the chance to witness the arrival of someone new. When the doors finally swung open, the crowd fell silent. Standing in the doorway was a man, but he didn't quite look like what they expected. His clothes were ragged and worn, hanging loosely from his frame. His boots were scuffed, his shirt faded and torn at the edges. His face was tired, but there was something about his eyes that caught Emma's attention. They were the eyes of someone who had seen hardship, someone who had survived the trials of the world and kept going. He stepped off the ship slowly, his movements hesitant, unsure. The dust of the planet settled around him as he looked around, taking in the small crowd that had gathered to meet him. There was a moment of awkward silence before someone in the crowd chuckled. "Well, I reckon we didn't get what we expected," a man called out, earning a few laughs from the others. Emma's father, Rancher Hayes, stood near the back of the crowd, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Emma stood among the crowd, her heart going out to the man in front of her. She had heard stories of strong, handsome men who had come to marry the women of Edgewood, but this man was different. His clothes were torn and his face showed the wear of a long journey. His appearance didn't fit the rough-and-tumble image of a man who could survive on a ranch in such harsh conditions. But there was something about him, something that made her take a step closer, despite the ridicule from the townsfolk. "Are you the one who's supposed to marry someone here?" she called out, her voice carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. The man looked up, startled by her directness. I think so," he replied, his voice soft, unsure. "I'm James." He looked down at his boots. His shoulders slumped slightly. "Well, James," Emma said, her voice calm, "I'm Emma. My father's the one you'll be working with, if you're still interested in this place." She gave him a small smile, trying to ease the tension that seemed to hang in the air. "You've traveled a long way, haven't you?" James nodded slowly, still looking down. "I have," he said. "I didn't expect it to be like this. But I'll do my best. I promise." Emma could see the sincerity in his eyes, despite his worn appearance. There was something different about him, something that made her believe in his words, even if the others were too quick to judge. She turned to the crowd, her gaze steady. "If you have any questions for him, you should ask him later," she said firmly. "Right now, he needs a moment to rest." The crowd murmured but began to disperse, the interest fading from their eyes as they returned to their work. Emma stayed behind, watching James as he stood in the clearing, unsure of his next move. Her father, Rancher Hayes, approached slowly, his boots crunching on the ground. He was a tall man, his face hardened by years of working the land. He studied James carefully, looking him up and down before speaking. "So you're the one they sent, huh?" Rancher Hayes asked, his voice low but firm. James nodded again, not meeting his gaze. "I am. I hope I'm not a disappointment." "You look like you've seen some rough times," Hayes observed, "but that doesn't matter much out here. What matters is whether you can work." "Can you?" "I can learn," James replied quietly. "I may not look it, but I'm capable." Emma could see the skepticism in her father's eyes, but there was something else there too, an interest, a spark of curiosity. He had seen many men come and go, but there was something about James that made him pause. "Well, I suppose you'll find out soon enough," Hayes said gruffly. I'll let you rest up for the night. Tomorrow we'll see if you're made of the right stuff." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving James standing alone in the clearing, Emma lingered for a moment longer, her gaze softening. She knew her father would put James through his paces. There was no other way. But she also knew that there was something more to this man than his rough appearance. He had come here to make a fresh start, and despite the way the others looked at him, she was willing to give him a chance. As the sun set behind the hills, Emma took one last look at James before heading back to the house. There was something about the way he stood there, his shoulders a little hunched, as if the weight of the world was on them. Emma couldn't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, this man had more to offer than anyone realized. Tomorrow would tell. The next morning the sun rose over the plains of New Eden, casting long shadows across the dirt road leading up to the ranch. The wind had picked up again, stirring the dry dust around the town of Edgewood, as if the land itself was waking up to the day. The sky above was a soft orange, like a reminder of how harsh the world could be out here. Emma stood by the front porch, watching as the morning light stretched over the horizon. She wasn't sure why, but something about the day felt different. Maybe it was because of James, the mail-order husband who had arrived the day before. The rest of the town had already forgotten about him, laughing at his ragged appearance and turning their backs. But Emma couldn't forget him. There was something in his eyes, a spark of determination, that made her believe he was worth a second chance. Rancher Hayes came out onto the porch, his boots crunching against the gravel. He stood beside Emma for a moment, staring out at the open plains. Then, without turning to her, he spoke. "Well, he's here, and he's still breathing," Hayes said, his voice rough. "But that doesn't mean much. You know how it is, Emma. This land doesn't care about who you are, only what you can do." Emma nodded quietly, looking over at James, who was standing near the barn, unsure of where to start. He had been up early, trying to shake off the exhaustion of the long journey, but now he looked like a man who didn't know what to do next. "Don't go easy on him, Emma," Hayes continued, his voice softer now. "If he wants to survive out here, he's going to have to prove himself. That means hard work, just like everyone else." Emma's heart sank. She knew her father wasn't wrong, but she couldn't help but feel sorry for James. He didn't deserve the mockery or the doubt. He was just trying to make a life for himself, like everyone else who had come to New Eden. But she also knew her father's words were true. This wasn't a place where you could afford to be weak or unprepared. The land was too unforgiving for that. James took a deep breath and straightened his back. Emma could see the weariness in his movements, but there was something else, too. A quiet resolve. He wasn't the kind of man to give up easily. That much she could tell. Hayes turned to Emma and nodded toward James. "Get him to work. He'll learn what it means to be part of this ranch today." Emma gave her father a quick nod. She couldn't argue with him. The best way to prove himself, to everyone in town and to her father, would be through action. She stepped off the porch and walked toward James, her boots kicking up the dirt as she moved. "James," she called out, her voice carrying over the distance, "you ready to start your first day?" He took a moment before answering, as if trying to find the right words. "I'm ready. Just tell me what to do." Emma gestured toward the barn. "First, we've got to fix the fence out back. It's been leaning for a while, and the cattle keep getting too close to it. You think you can handle that?" James nodded, though the doubt was still visible in his eyes. He wasn't sure if he could, but he wasn't about to back down. They walked toward the fence together, the sound of their footsteps the only noise as the morning passed. As they approached the area where the fence was leaning, Emma paused, looking it over. The posts were old and worn, and the wire was tangled in places. It would take a lot of work to get it standing strong again. James stood still for a moment, his hands at his sides, looking at the fence like it was a puzzle he wasn't sure how to solve. Emma could see him thinking, trying to figure out the best way to tackle it. She didn't say anything, just let him have a moment to assess the situation. Finally, James walked over to the nearest post and gave it a gentle tug. It wobbled, but it didn't move. He frowned, then walked a few steps back and grabbed a heavy mallet from the tools they had gathered. "You've got to put your back into it," Emma said, her voice steady but encouraging. "The land doesn't give you anything unless you work for it." "I know. I'll do my best." He raised the mallet high and brought it down on the post with a loud crack. The sound echoed across the land, followed by a sharp grunt as he tried again. He wasn't used to the hard labor, and his muscles protested at the effort. But he didn't stop. He kept going, each swing harder than the last. Emma watched him for a while, her arms crossed, but she didn't interrupt. This was his test not just of strength, but of his determination. She could see that he was giving it everything he had, even if he wasn't used to the work. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the post slid deeper into the ground. James stepped back, panting, his face red from exertion. He wiped the sweat from his brow and looked at Emma. "Is that good enough?" he asked, his voice uncertain. Emma gave him a small nod. "It'll do for now. Let's get the rest of the posts in place." The day wore on, and James worked alongside Emma, learning how to mend the fence, how to tie the wire, and how to use his strength in ways he had never needed before. The sun climbed higher in the sky, beating down on them both, but James didn't complain. Every time he started to falter, Emma was there, showing him how to adjust his grip or how to position his body to use the least energy. By the end of the day, the fence was standing tall again, solid and straight. As they walked back toward the house, Emma could see the exhaustion in James's posture, but there was something else there too. His shoulders were squared and his expression was different. There was pride in the way he held himself now. He had earned something today, even if it wasn't much. He had proven to himself that he could survive out here. "Well, you didn't give up," Emma said, breaking the silence between them. James looked at her, his expression softer now. "I wasn't planning on it." She smiled, though it was a small smile. "Good. Tomorrow we'll work on something else. The ranch isn't an easy place to live, but you'll get used to it." James nodded, but as they walked back to the house, he knew that this was just the beginning. If he wanted to stay, if he wanted to earn the respect of the others, he would have to keep working, and working hard. The next few days were just as hard as the first. James had learned quickly that life on the ranch was not kind to the weak. Every morning he woke before the sun, his muscles aching from the previous day's work. The tasks were endless: feeding the cattle, fixing more fences, and even tending to the garden Emma's mother had started before her passing. Each job seemed to require more strength than he had, yet each time he thought he couldn't go on, Emma's quiet encouragement pushed him forward. It was late in the afternoon when the storm came. The wind began to pick up first, a low rumble in the distance that made the horses restless in their pens. Emma stood on the porch, watching the sky darken with clouds that seemed to move too quickly. The air felt charged, thick with the promise of something dangerous. "James," Emma called from the doorway, her voice sharp with worry. "The cattle are getting agitated. We need to move them into the barn before the storm hits." James, who had been cleaning the barn, looked up, squinting against the wind. He could see the way the cattle were running, their hooves pounding the earth as they moved in erratic patterns. They were scared, and in the storm, that was a danger in itself. If they weren't brought under control, they might run right into the barbed wire or worse, get caught in the storm. "I'll get them," James called back, pushing through the barn doors and rushing toward the herd. Emma watched him go, the tension in her stomach rising. The storm was close now, and there was no time to waste. She grabbed her coat and followed, her boots pounding against the ground as she ran after James. When she reached the herd, the wind was howling and the first drops of rain began to fall, heavy and fast. The cattle were panicking now, running in every direction. James was already in the thick of it, shouting to try and calm them. But his voice was drowned out by the wind, and the animals were too far gone to hear reason. Emma's heart raced as she watched James struggle. She had never seen him like this before. He was out of his depth, but she could see something in his eyes, a spark of determination. She couldn't leave him to handle this alone. "James!" Emma shouted again, running to his side. The rain had turned into a downpour, the sky flashing with sudden bursts of lightning. The ground beneath them was turning to mud, making it harder to keep their footing. James turned to her, his face grim, but he didn't say anything. He was too focused on the herd. The storm was coming faster than they had anticipated. Emma quickly glanced around, assessing the situation. There was no time to bring the cattle into the barn the way they had planned. They had to get them under control, and fast. "Get to the front," Emma ordered, pointing toward the main gate, where the cattle were beginning to break through. "Keep them together, and don't let them split up." He turned and charged ahead, cutting through the mud and the rain as he pushed the cattle back into line. Emma followed, knowing that if they didn't work together, the herd would scatter and they would lose control. For what felt like hours, they moved through the rain, guiding the cattle through the mud, shouting at them to stay together. The storm raged around them, but neither of them stopped. The only sound that mattered was the pounding of hooves and the desperate cries of the cattle. Finally, they made it to the barn. Emma slammed the door shut behind them, her chest heaving with exhaustion. The cattle were in, safe from the storm. She turned to look at James, who stood in the middle of the barn, drenched to the bone but standing tall. His eyes met hers, and for the first time since his arrival, Emma saw a man who had earned his place on the ranch. He wasn't the broken, ragged stranger who had arrived days earlier. He had become part of this place, part of this world. That was close, Emma said, her voice low, trying to catch her breath. But we did it. You didn't have to stay out there. I could have handled it. I couldn't leave you out there alone, Emma replied, her voice soft. We're in this together now. James gave her a small smile, the first real one she had seen from him since he arrived. It wasn't much, but it meant something. It meant he was finally starting to feel like he belonged here. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the barn they were safe. The cattle were calm now, gathered in the dry corner of the barn. The wind howled against the walls, but the barn held strong, just like they had. Emma and James didn't speak much after that. They both knew that the storm was still far from over, and there was work to be done. But for a moment, in the quiet after the chaos, Emma felt something shift between them. Hours passed, and the storm eventually subsided. The night fell cold, but the stars were starting to peek through the clouds again. Emma sat at the table inside the house, a fire crackling in the hearth as she prepared a simple meal. James had gone to the barn to check on the cattle, making sure everything was in order after the storm. She knew it was a hard job, but he was proving to her day by day that he could handle it. When he finally came inside, his face was tired, but there was something different in his posture. He was still the same man who had arrived in rags, but now he was no longer a stranger to this land. He had earned his place not just by his work, but by his actions. He had stood beside Emma, not once asking for help, but offering it at every turn. The strength he had shown in the storm had proven that he was more than what others had thought of him. You did well today, Emma said, her voice gentle as he sat down across from her. James gave her a tired smile, rubbing his hands together to warm them. I couldn't have done it without you. We did it together. For the first time since his arrival, James seemed to relax. He had fought through the storm, both literal and metaphorical. And now, sitting here across from Emma, he realized that maybe this place wasn't as impossible as he had first thought. I'm not sure I'll ever be what everyone expects me to be, James said quietly, staring into the fire. But I know I can be something, and maybe that's enough. Emma reached across the table, placing her hand on his. She didn't say anything, but she didn't need to. They both knew what this moment meant. The storm had passed, and though the work was far from over, they had faced it together, and that, for both of them, was enough to build on. The days after the storm seemed to pass faster than James could keep up with. The hard work never stopped, but neither did his determination. Every day he woke up before the sun, ready to take on whatever the ranch required of him. The land was harsh, and the work was even harsher, but James had started to feel at home in the rhythm of it all. There were still challenges, of course. There always would be on a ranch like this. But he had earned the respect of Emma, and even her father, Rancher Hayes, had started to look at him differently. It wasn't much, but it was enough. James knew he wasn't the man he had been when he first arrived on New Eden. He had changed. And so had the way the people around him saw him. One evening, as the sun began to dip low on the horizon, Emma and James stood together by the barn. The work was mostly done for the day. The cattle were fed, the fences had been mended, and the chores were all taken care of. It had been a long, tiring day, but there was a quiet peace between them now. They had both worked hard for it. I think you're finally getting the hang of things, Emma said, her voice warm as she looked at James. You've come a long way since that first day. James smiled, though it was a tired smile. He glanced over at the cattle who were slowly grazing in the fields beyond the barn. I'm still not sure I'm ready to call myself a rancher, he admitted, his tone modest. But I'm doing what I can. You're doing more than that, Emma replied, her voice firm with conviction. You're making a life here. That's something. James felt a warmth spread in his chest at her words. It wasn't easy to hear, especially coming from someone like Emma, who had grown up in this world. She knew what it meant to truly belong to the land, to work for everything you had. But she was right. He had earned his place here. And even though he had a long way to go, he had the confidence now to face whatever came next. There was a silence between them for a moment, one that wasn't uncomfortable but instead peaceful. They stood together, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows on the ground. The ranch was quiet, save for the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the distant calls of birds returning to their nests. Finally, Emma spoke again, her voice a little softer this time. I've been thinking. You've done so much already. Maybe it's time we think about the future. Together. James turned to her, his brow furrowing slightly. What do you mean? Emma smiled, a small but meaningful smile. I mean, maybe we should start building something together. Not just a ranch, but a life.
A family. James's heart skipped a beat at her words.
He had never imagined something like this, never thought he would have the chance to build something with someone else. When he had first arrived, he had been so focused on surviving, on proving he was capable of handling the ranch, that he hadn't even thought about what he wanted for the future. But standing there now, with Emma beside him, he felt something stirring inside him. Something more than just the desire to survive. He wanted more. He wanted to build a future with her. I don't know what to say, James admitted, his voice low and hesitant. I've never had anything like that before. Emma reached out, her hand gently touching his. It's okay to be unsure. We're both starting from scratch here. But I think we've got a good foundation, and if we keep working together, we can make something special. James looked down at her hand in his, feeling the warmth of it seep into his skin. He had come here with nothing, a stranger in a strange land, and now he was standing beside a woman who believed in him. It was more than he had ever hoped for. I'd like that, he said quietly, meeting her eyes. I'd like to build something with you. Emma smiled, a genuine bright smile that made James's heart feel full. Then we'll do it, together. Over the next few weeks, the work on the ranch continued, but it wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about building. James and Emma worked side by side, each task bringing them closer together. The work was still hard, but there was a new energy between them, one of shared purpose and determination. They weren't just partners in work anymore, they were partners in life. James had never imagined a future like this, a future where he was more than just a man struggling to survive. He was building something with Emma, something that would last, and that gave him a sense of pride he had never known before. The days grew warmer, and the ranch began to thrive. The cattle were healthy, the fields were full, and the land seemed to smile at them for the first time. But it wasn't just the land that had changed. James had changed too. He was no longer the man who had arrived in rags, unsure of his place. He was a man who had earned his right to be here, a man who had found not just a home, but a future. One afternoon, Emma and James sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the ranch. The wind had settled, and the day was calm. The work was done for the day, and all that was left was to enjoy the quiet peace they had fought so hard to create. I think we're finally getting somewhere, James said, his voice soft as he leaned back in his chair. This place. It feels like home now. Emma nodded, her eyes soft with contentment. It feels like home because we built it together. This is ours. James looked over at her, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I don't think I ever thought I'd have a place to call my own, he admitted. But now with you, I don't ever want to leave. Emma smiled, and for the first time she reached over and took his hand in hers. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. They had come a long way together, and the future felt brighter than it ever had before. We'll keep building, she said softly. One step at a time. Together. James squeezed her hand, his heart full. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but with Emma by his side, he knew they could face whatever came their way. They had built something strong, something real. And no storm could take that away. As the stars began to fill the night sky, James sat back and looked out over the ranch. It was quiet now, the world around them at peace, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was meant to be.